wind cut through the canyon like a whetted knife, carrying the metallic scent of snow and the heavier copper tang of spilled blood. Thane adjusted his collar, pulling the sheepkin higher against a cold that sought to freeze the marrow in his bones. His horse, a ran mare named Bess, huffed a nervous cloud of steam, her ears twitching toward the ravine floor. Thane didn't need to see the wreckage to know that peace had been broken. The silence of the high country felt bruised. He guided the mare down the scree, the stones clicking sharply under iron shoes, until the source of the disturbance came into view. It was a wagon, or what remained of one, shattered against the granite teeth of the cliff base. The canvas was torn to ribbons, flapping with a desolate snap in the gale. Bodies lay scattered, half buried in the drifting white, motionless lumps that the snow was already claiming for its own. Thane dismounted, his boots crunching loudly in the quiet. He kept his hand near the navy colt at his hip, though the attackers were long gone. The scene spoke of a swift, brutal ambush, likely 2 days past given the frost on the wood. He moved from one form to the next, checking for a pulse he knew he wouldn't find, his face impassive. It was a grim duty, one the frontier demanded of the living. He was about to turn back, to leave the dead for the spring thaw, when a flash of color caught his eye. It was violently out of place in this world of grays, browns, and whites, a vivid, blood-deep crimson. He moved toward the overturned carriage bed. There, sheltered slightly by the broken axle, lay a woman. She was not dressed for the territory, nor for the weather. She wore a long, silken gown of red, embroidered with golden threads that shimmered even in the flat winter light. Her skin was the color of old ivory, pale and dangerously cold. Thane knelt, pulling off his glove to press 2 fingers against her neck. The skin was ice, but beneath it, a faint, thready flutter fought against the silence. She was alive. He wasted no time. Stripping off his heavy coat, he wrapped her in the warmth of his own body heat and the thick wool. She was light, terrifyingly so, as he lifted her into his arms. Her head lolled against his chest, her black hair spilling over his arm like spilled ink. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. "I've got you." It was a promise made to the wind as much as to her. He mounted Bess with the woman cradled across the saddlebow, urging the horse into a trot. The sky was darkening, bruising purple in the west. A storm was coming, and they had miles to go before the safety of the timberline. The ride back to the cabin was a battle against the encroaching night. The temperature plummeted, the wind rising to a howl that stripped the heat from exposed skin in seconds. Thane kept one arm clamped around the woman, feeling the alarming stillness of her form. She hadn't shivered once, a sign that the cold had gone deep, past the point of pain and into the dangerous lethargy of freezing. His cabin sat nestled in a grove of lodgepole pine, a sturdy structure of hand-hewn logs that had withstood a decade of winters. He didn't wait to stable Bess, leaving her in the lee of the barn with a promise of oats later, and kicked the cabin door open. The interior was dark, smelling of wood smoke and dried sage. He carried the woman to the hearth, laying her on the bear rug before quickly building up the embers of the morning's fire. The flames caught, casting dancing shadows against the rough walls. Now in the firelight, the incongruity of her presence was stark. The red dress, a cheong sam, though Thane didn't know the word, was made of silk, so fine it seemed like water, covered in intricate stitching of birds and flowers. It was torn at the hem and stained with mud, but the richness of it made the rough, hewn floorboards look even more primitive. He had to get her warm, but gradually. He filled a kettle with water and set it on the hook, then turned back to her. Her shoes were delicate, embroidered slippers, completely soaked through. He removed them gently, his large, calloused hands looking monstrous next to her slender feet. Her toes were white and waxy. He rubbed them briskly, trying to force circulation back, watching her face for any sign of pain. There was none. She remained in a coma-like sleep, her breathing shallow. Thane moved with a practiced, stoic efficiency. He had nursed calves through blizzards and mended his own wounds, but this felt fragile in a way he wasn't used to. He dampened a cloth in warm water and wiped the grime from her face. She was beautiful, with high cheekbones and a mouth that looked too soft for this hard country. The door latch, a reminder of the death she had narrowly escaped. For the first time in years, the cabin felt crowded. The silence he usually cherished now felt heavy with unspoken questions. Who was she? Why was a woman dressed like royalty traveling through the worst pass in the territory in the dead of winter? And who had wanted her dead enough to slaughter her escorts and leave her to the wolves? He sat up with her through the night, feeding the fire until the cabin was sweltering. Sometime near dawn, a sound broke the stillness, a sharp intake of breath. Thane looked up from the harness he was mending. The woman's eyes were open. They were dark, terrified, and darting around the room like a trapped bird. She scrambled backward, pushing herself against the rough stones of the hearth, clutching the blanket to her chin. She spoke a string of words in a language Thane didn't understand, the sounds musical but frantic. He set the leather down slowly and raised his open hands. "Easy," he said, keeping his voice low and level, the way he would speak to a spooked colt. "You're safe here. No one's going to hurt you." She didn't seem to understand the words, but she understood the tone. Her eyes fixed on him, assessing. She took in his size, the beard, the gun belt hanging on the peg by the door. She trembled, not from cold now, but from adrenaline. Thane stood up slowly and moved to the stove. He ladled broth into a tin cup, the steam rising in a savory cloud. He placed the cup on the floor midway between them, then retreated to his chair. "Eat," he said, pantomiming the action. She watched him for a long time, her chest heaving. Slowly realizing he wasn't going to attack, her survival instinct overrode her fear. She crawled forward, the red silk of her ruined dress rustling softly, and took the cup with shaking hands. She drank greedily, choking slightly on the first sip before forcing herself to slow down. Thane watched her out of the corner of his eye, careful not to stare. He saw the way she held the cup with two hands, fingers graceful despite the tremors. She wasn't a settler's wife or a saloon girl. There was a discipline in her posture, even in her terror. When she finished, she set the cup down and looked at him. "Thank you," she whispered. The English words were heavily accented, sounding foreign in her mouth, as if she had learned them from a book rather than conversation. Thane nodded once. "I'm Thane," he said, tapping his chest. She hesitated, her eyes flickering to the window where the snow was piling up against the glass. She seemed to be weighing the cost of a name. Finally, she lowered her gaze. "Mei Yin," she said softly. It sounded like a bell in the smoke-filled room. The storm outside howled, sealing them into this small shared space. Two strangers from different worlds, bound by the simple fact of survival. Recovery was measured in small increments, marked by the changing light on the floorboards and the dwindling woodpile. For the first 2 days, Min barely moved from the hearth, sleeping for hours as her body repaired the trauma of the cold. Thane went about his routines, chopping wood, checking the trap lines near the creek, tending to Bess, but he was always conscious of the presence in his home. The cabin, once a purely functional space, began to shift. He found himself walking softer, closing the door with care rather than letting it slam. When he came in from the cold, stamping snow from his boots, he would find her awake, watching him with dark, guarded eyes. They spoke little. The barrier of language was thick, but necessity created a bridge. He learned that she preferred tea to coffee, wrinkling her nose at the bitter brew he usually drank. He found a tin of dried mint he'd saved and brewed that for her. The faint smile she gave him was the first break in her mask. On the third afternoon, the fever that had threatened her finally broke. Thane returned from the barn to find her sitting up, examining the red dress she had been wearing. He had draped it over a chair to dry, and now she held the fabric in her hands, tracing the jagged tear that ran from the knee to the hip. The silk was stained and stiff with dried mud, the golden embroidery frayed. To it looked like a ruined rag, useless for the winter. To her, it clearly meant something else. She looked up as he entered, her expression distressed. She mimed a sewing motion, pointing to the tear. Thane hesitated. His own repair kit was meant for canvas, leather, and thick wool. He retrieved a battered tin box from under his bunk and opened it. Inside were heavy needles, thick black thread, and sinew. He handed it to her, feeling a strange embarrassment for the coarseness of his tools. Min took the tin, examining the contents. She picked up a needle that must have looked like a spike to her, and a spool of rough thread. She looked at the delicate silk, then at the needle. It was impossible. Yet she didn't weep. She simply nodded, a gesture of pragmatic acceptance that surprised him. She sat by the window to catch the fading light and began to work. It was slow, painstaking labor. She had to unweave strands of the rough thread to make it thinner, using her teeth and nails. Thane watched her from the kitchen table as he oiled his rifle. He saw the determination in her jaw, the way she forced the clumsy tools to obey her will. She wasn't just mending a dress, she was reclaiming a piece of herself. By the time the storm finally broke, revealing a world sculpted in blinding white, a fragile rhythm had established itself between them. The dress was mended, though the black thread stood out like a scar against the red silk. Mlin wore it with a dignity that made the damage seem irrelevant. She refused to be idle. Though her strength was still returning, she insisted on helping. She couldn't chop wood or haul water, but she took over the interior. She swept the floor with a meticulousness that Thne had never bothered with. She reorganized his pantry, stacking the tins in a logic he didn't understand, but didn't challenge. One evening, as Thane sat whittling a new handle for his axe, he felt her watching him. He looked up. She was holding a bowl of stew she had heated, adding dried herbs she had found in his stores that he rarely used. The smell was richer, more complex than his usual fare. "You have strong hands," she said, struggling with the words, pointing to his carving. Her voice was quiet, melodic. Thane looked at his hands, scarred, stained with oil and pitch, knuckles swollen from years of fighting the land. "They work," he answered simply. He took the bowl from her. "Thank you." She sat opposite him, her back straight. The firelight caught the gold threads of her dress, making the dragon embroidered there seem awry. Thane took a bite of the stew. It was delicious. He set the spoon down. "The men in the wagon," he said, venturing into the dangerous territory of the past. "They weren't just drivers. It wasn't a question." He had seen the quality of the weapons scattered in the snow, the specific way the bodies had fallen defensively. Min went still. Her gaze dropped to her hands, which were folded in her lap. "No," she said softly. "Guardians." She looked up, and for a moment the mask slipped, revealing a depth of sorrow that made Thane look away. "They die for me." The weight of that sentence hung in the air. Thane realized then that he hadn't just rescued a traveler. He had pulled a focal point of violence out of the snow. He nodded slowly, acknowledging the debt she carried. "The snow covers the tracks," he said, offering the only comfort he had, strategic safety. "No one can find this place until the thaw." She looked at the door, then back at him, her eyes searching his face for deceit. Finding none, she exhaled, a long, shuddering sound. "Until the thaw," she repeated. It was a reprieve, not a solution. But in the high country, a reprieve was all anyone ever got. Weeks turned into a month, the days bleeding together in a slow, hypnotic rhythm of survival. The cabin, once a place of solitary confinement for Thane, had transformed into a shared vessel navigating the wide ocean of the frontier. Min's strength returned, not in a sudden rush, but like the slow creeping of frost across a window pane. She began to venture outside, wrapped in Thane's spare coat, which swallowed her small frame. the red hem of her cheong sam peeking out like a wound against the snow. She watched him work with an intensity that made the hair on his arms stand up. One evening, after the dinner dishes were cleared, she sat at the rough who-need table with a piece of charcoal she had plucked from the cold hearth. On the back of an old supply ledger, she began to draw. It was not a picture, but a column of intricate vertical strokes, characters that looked like falling rain frozen in time. Thni watched her hand move, the grace of it at odds with the soot staining her fingers. "What is it?" he asked, his voice rasping in the quiet room. He was oiling the leather of his bridle, the smell of neat suit oil mixing with the scent of pine. Min paused, the charcoal hovering over the paper. She didn't look up immediately. "A poem," she said, her English improving with the daily necessity of communication, "from my home. It says, 'The mountain does not bow to the wind.'" She looked at him then, and the firelight caught the dark, liquid depth of her eyes. "My father, he is a powerful man. He promised me to a general, a man who conquers." She looked down at the paper, her hand tightening until the charcoal snapped. "I did not wish to be conquered." The silence that followed was heavy. Thane understood then the true weight of what lay in the ravine. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a runaway piece of a dynasty, a stolen jewel that powerful men would burn cities to recover. He reached across the table, covering her soot-stained hand with his own. His palm was rough, callous like old bark, but his touch was gentle. "You aren't property," he said, the words low and hard as iron. "Not here." Min didn't pull away. She turned her hand over, interlacing her slender fingers with his, a silent pact forged in the shadow of the fire. The false spring arrived with a treacherous beauty, the sun melting the surface of the drifts during the day, only for them to freeze into sheets of ice at night. It was on one of these blindingly bright afternoons that the isolation was broken. Thane was by the corral, breaking ice in the trough for Bess, when the mayor's ears pinned back. She let out a low, warning snort. Thane froze, his hand dropping instinctively to the Colt Navy at his hip. He scanned the tree. A rider emerged from the shadows of the pines, a silhouette cut from darkness against the glare of the snow. The horse was black, stepping high and careful, and the man atop it sat with a posture that spoke of city streets and paid violence. He wore a long gray duster and a flat-brimmed hat that shaded his eyes. He wasn't a drifter, he was a hunter. Thane didn't look back at the cabin, praying Min had seen the approach from the window and followed their plan. He walked to the gate, leaning against the post with a casualness he didn't feel. The rider stopped 10 yards out. He was a handsome man in a sharp, reptilian way, his face smooth and his eyes pale as winter sky. "Afternoon," the stranger said, his voice polite, carrying the lilt tilt of the southern states. "You're a hard man to find." Thane didn't smile. "I'm not lost." The stranger chuckled, a dry sound, like dry leaves skittering on stone. "No, I suppose not, but something else is." He leaned forward, resting his gloved hands on the saddle horn. "I'm looking for a wagon and a passenger, a young woman, likely dressed in unusual finery." Thane held the man's gaze, his face a mask of bored indifference. "Found a wagon in the ravine 2 weeks back." Thane lied smoothly, blending truth with deception. "Smashed to kindling. Wolves had been at the bodies. Didn't see any woman." The stranger's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. He looked past Thane toward the cabin where a thin wisp of smoke curled from the chimney. "Wolves," he repeated softly. "They are thorough creatures, but they usually leave bones." He straightened up, gathering his res. "I'm Graves. I'll be camped down by the creek. If you remember anything, there is a substantial reward, gold enough to buy this whole mountain." Thane watched Graves right away, disappearing into the timber as the sun began to dip behind the peaks. He knew the man hadn't bought the lie. Graves moved like a man who knew exactly where the prey was hiding and was simply waiting for the perfect angle to strike. Thane returned to the cabin, bolting the heavy door behind him. Min was standing in the shadows of the kitchen, clutching a paring knife, her knuckles white. She looked at him, the question burning in her eyes. "He knows," Thane said, stripping off his coat. He moved to the gun rack, taking down the Winchester lever action. He checked the magazine, the brass cartridges gleaming in the dim light. "He's waiting for dark." Min stepped forward, the fear in her face hardening into something brittle and fierce. "I can go," she whispered. "If I go to him, he leaves you." Thane looked at her, and the thought of her walking out into the snow to surrender to that man made his chest ache with a sharp physical pain. "No," he said. He walked to her, placing his hands on her shoulders. "We hold the door." Night fell like a hammer, extinguishing the world outside the cabin. Thane extinguished the lantern, leaving only the dying embers of the fire to cast a dull red glow. He positioned himself by the window. The shutter cracked open an inch, the rifle resting on the sill. Min sat on the floor beneath the sill, out of the line of fire, her breathing shallow and controlled. Hours passed. The wind picked up, whistling through the chinking of the logs, masking the sound of footsteps echoed outside. Then the bedroom window exploded inward. It wasn't a bullet. It was a firebrand, a rag soaked in kerosene and tied around a stone. It landed on the bed, flames spreading fast across the dry quilt. Thane spun, shouting for Min to get down, but she was already moving. She seized the thick wool rug and flung it over the fire, stamping hard, smothering the flames before they could climb higher. At that same instant, the front door shuddered under a violent blow. Graves was done waiting. Thane didn't hesitate. He fired through the wood, the crack of the Winchester thunderous in the tight cabin. A cry of pain answered from outside, followed by two quick shots that splintered the frame. Shards of wood sprang into the room. "The back!" Thane shouted, levering another round into the chamber. Men like Graves never came alone. But the back door stayed silent. The front door burst open, the lock giving way. Graves filled the doorway, silvered by moonlight, a revolver in each hand. He was quick. Thane was ready. Dropping to one knee, Thane fired upward. The shot struck Graves in the chest, throwing him back into the snow. Silence followed, thick and ringing. Thane rose slowly, rifle still trained on the doorway, and stepped outside. Graves lay on his back, breath wet and shallow. The charm was gone from his face, replaced by stunned disbelief. He died without a word. The darkness simply claimed him. For a long moment, Thane stood there, the rush draining away, leaving only a cold, heavy exhaustion. A hand touched his arm. Min stood beside him, trembling in the night air. She looked at the body, steady and unflinching. Then she looked at Thane and gave a small nod. It was acceptance of what had been necessary, of what it meant to stay. At dawn, they buried Graves beyond the tree line, the ground still hard from frost. They marked the grave with a simple pile of stones. It was practical, to hide what had happened, but it also felt like burying the fear that had chased her for so long. When they returned to the cabin, the air seemed lighter. Min opened the trunk that held her few belongings. From it, she lifted the red cheongsam, clean now, carefully mended. Silk and gold embroidery, something meant for lantern-lit halls, not a rough frontier cabin. She traced the stitching with her thumb. Then she folded it inside out so only the dull lining showed and placed it at the very bottom of the trunk. "It is too loud for this life," she said quietly. She picked up the flannel shirt Thane had given her and slipped it on. It hung loose on her frame, sleeves swallowing her hands, but she rolled them up with calm determination. She lifted her chin. "I am Mei Lin," she said, as though naming herself anew. "I stay." Weeks later, spring came in earnest. The valley burst into green. The creek swelled with meltwater, and the air carried the scent of wet earth and pine. Thane and Mei Lin worked the lower pasture fence, repairing rails broken by winter storms. It was hard, steady labor. Thane hoisted the cedar rails into place. Mei Lin secured them with wire, her leather-gloved hands swift and sure. They spoke little. They didn't need to. The rhythm of their work was conversation enough. The passing of tools, shared water, movements falling naturally into sync as they rebuilt the boundary of their home. When the sun stood high overhead, they rested on a flat rock overlooking the valley. Thane removed his hat and wiped his brow. He looked at her. Her cheeks were flushed from effort, a streak of dirt across her skin, her hair pulled back in a practical braid. She looked nothing like the fragile woman he had once carried from the snow, and yet she had never seemed more beautiful. She caught him watching and smiled, open, unguarded, reaching her eyes. Thane reached out, his hand brushing hers against the warm stone. He didn't pull away, neither did she. Above them, a hawk circled lazily in the wide blue sky as they sat together, gazing over the land they had claimed. Two solitary souls, bound first by winter, now held fast by something quieter, stronger, a promise built to endure.